So yeah, I think the focus today again is going through environments rather than characters this time and trying to really go through a couple of ways that you can drive control and consistency in creating environments. Um, I think the use cases here vary pretty dramatically in the sense that you might have a number of different pipelines or workflows if you're trying to create an environment. You might be working on a 2D platformer, which probably has a completely different use case and need than if you're creating kind of environment concept art. With a 2D platformer, you're actually building out levels and assets using Invoke. And in those cases, you're probably passing in things like, the level block itself. So if you've got kind of like platforms and where things are, you're using a control net to do that. I do have an example of how you can use Blender to get some control around composition and how you can use other images as well to control for that. But we'll dive in just a moment here. Maybe the next step is kind of sourcing ideas from the audience around workflows that they want to see us go through from an environment perspective. Devin, you want to prompt them with the question and then kind of guide me through what people are asking for?
Sure. Do you want us to? Yeah, so we're going to I think first step is kind of showing, and this is the challenge to you, Kent, is creating a series of images that could all be within the same, say, world. Um, and to the audience, I'd like to pose the question of what world do we want Kent to be creating in? That's question number one. And question number two, are there any techniques or features that you'd like us to try to show in that process? And we'll see what we can do. If it makes sense, we'll try and get those in.
Cool. Sounds good. Um, just fiddling
Just
around
drop
with
that in
some
the
of
chat.
my advanced options here. I'm not, so one of the upcoming videos that we'll publish for getting started will focus on these generation advanced settings. I know that there's like probably some debate in the community about whether these are advanced or not. But I think that the average person who's getting started with this stuff is probably not going to fiddle with these too much. And candidly, I only fiddle with them really before I start a session. Most of the time, once I get a good base, I'm not fiddling around with them too much, which is why they get collapsed. So I'll do that here, but you can kind of peek at the options that I had. See what I'm using. Follow along if you want to. We have any good themes that we see coming up?
If we don't get any themes from the audience, we'll have to do my surrealist medieval. So I'm seeing post-apocalyptic world.
Post-apocalyptic world where everything is made of candy. It's
Modern day Olympus.
yeah. My son recently turned 4 and is now playing the game Candyland. So I do have a lot of ideas here about a post-apocalyptic Candyland. It's not a bad prompt.
You want to do post-apocalyptic
Yeah,
as a guide for
we
the
can do
next hour?
we can do post-apocalyptic. Yeah, we'll do post-apocalyptic. Why not? There's a lot of opportunity to play around with that. So as always, I think the first place to start with driving for consistency is getting a prompt together that works really well for what you're trying to do. I know that it's kind of the simplest tool that we have in the toolbox, but it is particularly powerful because it is what is being passed in and controlling that invocation. I think the other tools that we have in the toolbox that I'll pull out to showcase are things like LoRa's. I think the important thing around understanding the relationship between the prompt and the model or the LoRa is that these are not isolated. You could have the best prompt in the world, but if the model or the LoRa together don't have an understanding of what you're prompting for, then it's kind of like it doesn't work. And this is why when you switch between different models, when you use different LoRa's, there is a significant difference in the output. And it's because they actually are understanding your prompt differently based on what they were kind of fine-tuned or trained to do. And it's why also when you train a model, you're not just training it with new pictures. You are training in new language. You're teaching it kind of what you want it to understand when you ask for something. When we work with our customers, a lot of times that's effectively what we're helping them do, is create the language that they can then use to deploy into their creative process, wherever that is. And so, you know, I'll touch on how, you might use a general purpose LoRa and how the trigger words operate and how that'll drive consistency. But for now, I'll just focus on just the original prompt. The post-apocalyptic world. And how I'm going to structure this is I'm going to kind of have environment artwork of a post-apocalyptic world be prefixed to every prompt. And then I've got this kind of like stylistic piece towards the end, which just has a number of terms that I'm using to make it feel a little bit more painterly and make it feel more concept art like. If I were going for a different part of the pipeline, this would probably be a different prompt. I'd have a different style. But keeping these consistent between image generations using the same model and LoRa will drive a lot of that consistency, because you're actually kind of invoking the same style and the same look while changing the subject. This isn't always perfect, and this is where things like IP adapter can really save you and kind of drive a lot of that consistency home. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the other ways we can control composition as we go forward. So first things first, we have to think about like the environment we're looking at. The one that kind of comes to mind for me, I played a lot of Fallout. It's just kind of like whenever you were like roaming the wasteland and you came across like one of those abandoned schoolyards, and it's like you're like in the school. That one is particularly poignant. So we'll see if we can create one of these.
There's never anything good inside those schools.
There's never anything. Maybe some good like weapons or something like that, like a ruler that you can use as a baseball bat. I think this might be inside the school. That's what we're seeing here. It's like the empty cafeteria. And in this case, we're inside the school. We like the look, but we want it to really focus on the schoolyard. And so we'll increase the weight of that and also put exterior, just so that it's really focused on that kind of like exterior element. We might also put in interior in our negative prompt. And that's kind of just, again, dynamically composing this prompt that really focuses on the outside of something. So we'll try that again. I may switch my scheduler around just a little bit to make this more efficient. But it seems to be going fine. So we've got this kind of dynamic image here of the outside of the schoolyard. We do have kind of this like dark look to this. It's pulling in a lot of the shadows and kind of the darkness. I think that's probably because of this term chiaroscuro. I mentioned this maybe in the last studio session, but if you pick up one of those old art history books and you just kind of pull some of these terms out that describe these stylistic choices that you find in art, this can really give you a better vocabulary if you're using a general purpose model and you kind of wanted to invoke that stuff. So chiaroscuro is one that I like to throw in anytime I'm looking for that type of light to dark depth. We'll take that out because we might want this to be daytime, and maybe we even want this same school. So this, this is an interesting piece. Maybe I'll go down this rabbit hole of like, we want consistency, but we don't want just consistency in style. Maybe we also want consistency in structure. Like we need the same building, but in daytime and nighttime to kind of show, maybe the weird zombie creatures of our post-apocalyptic world come out at night, and we need to show kind of like daytime all is normal, but at night we've got these kind of creatures roaming around. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my control nets, and I'll use depth. One thing that I'll call out, I know that this was highlighted in the release notes, but just for people who aren't aware, the Depth Anything model, which was just recently released in the open source research, that has been made the default for any of the depth control nets that you're going to use. And Depth Anything is extremely good. It's a very, very powerful depth model, and it can really kind of pull out a lot of this. Now we'll see how I've just typed it up, and so we'll see if it's like perfect when I use it. But overall, it is very powerful, and you can kind of see it pulled out the structure of that building relatively well. What we are going to hope for is that we get something that looks relatively similar to our school. We'll try a couple of techniques here if we struggle, but probably give this a shot. So we
some questions about your hardware that you're running and the model.
Yeah, definitely. So this is a 4090, which is a relatively quick graphics card. So it's moving pretty zippy through this. And the model is really just kind of like it's got a small set of derivatives on top of a Juggernaut XL model. This is just something that I've kind of personally used and merged together. Oh, we got this exterior during daytime, but it's like a brick wall type thing. So yeah, if you're looking for something that is similar, I would use the Juggernaut XL base. I think a lot of people find that if you take a really good base and maybe something else that you like that is stylistically kind of like an extension of that base model, you can merge those together and get something that's pretty useful for yourself. That's typically what I'd recommend. But Juggernaut XL is like one of the more general purpose models that's out there right now and that I find useful. So yeah, now we've got this kind of exterior, but I would say it looks a lot different than our original building. And so what we can try to do here is, what's missing from the depth is going to be a lot of the details. So, we've got the general shape of the building in 3D space, but what we really want is a lot of those finer details. And that's where you can add a second control net, and you can focus on things like the details by using something like Canny. And it's good to make sure that you evaluate the pre-processed image. So we've talked about this in some of the beginner videos, but when you're doing Canny or any control net really, you're taking the image, you're having it kind of processed through a machine learning model or an algorithm that's looking at it for characteristics. The Canny processor's looking at edges, and then those edges are passed into the control net. The edges are what is actually guiding that generation process. So in this case, if we were to take this preview image, which has a couple of edges, but not really like, it's not all of the ones that we want in the image, we're not really going to get a whole lot of useful control here. What you're doing with the Canny processor advanced settings when you open it up is you're changing the thresholds. You're changing how sensitive that algorithm is in finding edges. And so we want that threshold to be lower so that it finds more edges. If you find that you're getting too many edges in your output, that typically means you've got the threshold too high. Yeah, I said that the wrong way. Yeah, the other way around. So we're going to lower this because we want to get more of those edges in. Let's see how many we can get before this gets too cluttered. So yeah, this is probably too many because we're going to get a lot of the kind of crud on the ground as well. So we're going to kind of drag this up and see if we can get this to where we think we're passing in a lot of information about the windows, but aren't going to get too much other stuff. Let's look at this. Yeah, I think this should be a good shot for us. So we'll give this a go. And obviously, the more control adapters you add to the process, the more processing power it's going to take, and so the slower it's going to be typically.
Is there an upper limit on number of control adapters that you?
I think that
The limit does not exist.
the graphics card is your limit. You can generate really however much your card can handle. It's all dictated by VRAM, and that's why when you're looking at local compute, you're looking at VRAM as a constraint. If you use a hosted product like Invoke's service, we're effectively using the same that you would get from with the 4090. It's 24 gigabytes, and you get a lot of that same flexibility to do control nets and IP adapters, yada yada yada, on top of one another. This is also where if you are using a smaller graphics card, if you've got lower VRAM constraints, you're typically going to use things like T to I adapter if you're using SDXL, because T to I adapter is a smaller way to control the model. It's the same kind of thing as ControlNet, but it's a little bit less powerful of control, but you save a lot of memory as a result. So we've got our school during the night and during the day. Obviously, there's probably some details we could go in and touch up if we wanted to make these perfect one-to-ones. But I think for the purposes of capturing the concept and really showing kind of different daytime, nighttime elements, this is a really good foundation to build on top of, right? And I think there's a super useful workflow here in using control nets to kind of guide that transformation process. So we'll get rid of the schoolyard. And we'll kind of move on to the next building in our post-apocalyptic world. People can certainly shout out things that they are thinking of our post-apocalyptic world. And if I'm missing any of those suggestions, Devin, please just let me know. But I'll touch on the Blender piece and kind of how using that as a control element, because I think it's a super interesting tool in the toolbox. When you think about what you are passing into these models for ControlNet, or even for image-to-image processes or canvas processes, you are either passing in color information or structure information. So color is typically going to be that kind of image-to-image, and there's some structure in there as well, but it's more of like where in the 2D space of the image are certain colors, not really the same type of control as you'd get with a control adapter. But the control nets and T to I adapters are really good at this kind of compositional control. And when you think about what you're doing with a depth control net, is you're passing in depth information. And you can create synthetic depth information using Blender, right? You can create a structure, you can create different elements where things might be. And this is a really useful tool for kind of structuring the type of image, where in the image things need to be, how you're framing the image. This is kind of that artistic component of this is where in space things ought to be in the image. So in this case, I just created a couple of shapes inside of Blender. Obviously, they're very rough. That's not super detailed. I'm just trying to block out the composition. You could certainly go in and do some more fine-tuned sculpting and modeling and get even more control, but this is meant to be a rough depth control net input. And this is just to shape where in the image things are, the type of structure I'm looking at, and how I might want that to look. So I'll add in another depth control net, and I'll use this guy in here. And you can see that depth model has now pulled out this shape and it's kind of blocked it out. Typically what I'm going to want to do here is I'm going to want to decrease the weight, because I'm not exactly trying to get it to do this very big rectangle shape. I'm kind of giving it a little bit of freedom around the edges. You can almost imagine this as like expanding as a cloud of fog. When I have it set to 1, it's going to be strict to the shape of the rectangle. When I decrease it, it's kind of getting foggy outside of those bounds. It's going to be generally in that area, but it's got a lot more flexibility to maybe add some of those details that might be interesting. So we'll take out our abandoned schoolyard and we'll do a city hall marble. Help me out, Devin. What are some other things that we might see at a city hall? Flag.
Flags, fountains,
Fountains
stones, uh,
and stone. All right, we'll give that a shot. Uh, and
gates.
okay, so we'll do one of these guys. Interior still in our negative, which is good. I think this might actually be doing an interior. Oh, this is an interesting. It's doing a fountain inside of City Hall, which is pretty amusing.
Nice.
It's pretty amusing. Okay, so we'll
It's a
do.
beautiful fountain.
It is pretty. It's pretty. City Hall exterior, a building in a desolate landscape, marble fountains. We'll maybe downplay the fountains a little bit and see if that gives us something a little bit more aligned with what we're going for in our other style. And this, I think this is a really good example of how subject can sometimes be very tied to style. So you'll notice that that image of the fountain inside of City Hall looked like a photo, despite all of the prompting we have around it. And that's because fountains inside City Hall typically are photos, right? People don't make many kind of pieces of art that highlight that. We could control that a different way as well. But this is a good example of like how this might work when we're trying to go for something more artistic. Is we're going to control it using the prompt. We're going to make sure that the context maps to the types of things that are typically seen, and then now we've got our city hall. Obviously the the city hall text and kind of that piece up there would need to be updated. But you can see how the shape and structure of our input is ultimately controlling a lot of this generation piece. We even have some kind of like abandoned vehicles. The landscape here is truly desolate. There are no other buildings. But obviously, there's a lot of ways that we could use this asset if we wanted to. And if we look at, the types of things that we're seeing between these, we're starting to get kind of like a picture of our world in some way, shape, and form. Now, I think the thing that we'll go back to is how do I make sure that I get the same style that I'm looking for? If, for example, if we have this come out and we see this kind of like, oh, okay, well, it took that and it kind of went down this photography route. How can we really hammer home the style we're going for? And this is where things like LoRa's are really powerful, because you can actually modify the underlying model to really focus on those new concepts and those new elements, either character styles or other tools like equipment and concepts like whether they've got certain emotions. There's all kinds of LoRa models that you can use to really fine tune and control the generation. But in this case, I'm going to go through and I'm going to add in oil. So we'll do an oil painting and we'll kind of start to see that we can control the style of this. I'm going to pull the prompt out of this one because I really want to play around with this specific image. So I pulled the seed out, I pulled the prompt out. If I didn't have the LoRa, it would generate the exact same image. And so now I'm just layering the LoRa in so we can kind of compare the before and after of using a LoRa for this type of use case. And I think this will really highlight how a LoRa impacts the overall generation process. It might be a oil painting of this, or it might be that because we've really injected a better understanding of what we're going for, it's actually dynamically changing a lot of the relationships of the words to pull out what we kind of originally intended. So we'll give this a shot with our oil Laura and see what we get. It's always a little
You
bit
also
messy.
touch on the detail manual seed versus random seed, because I think that's something in the left side that sometimes beginners might miss as like an input into the generation process.
Yeah, sure. So I think the important thing to understand with this technology is that it is partly deterministic in the sense that if you are processing the exact same settings, you have the ability to control getting the same image. And so the seed is what controls that initial set of noise that the AI model is processing. And if it is the exact same set of noise and you have the exact same settings, it's going to roughly generate the same image. It's kind of passing through this. You can almost think of it like one of those Rube Goldberg machines that is using math to get to the answer of what's inside the resulting image. And so tweaking that is part of the craft of like getting to what you're looking for. So in this case, we started with a 0.5 weight on our oil Laura, and so I'm going to increase that to 0.92 and we'll see what we get. I think in this case, it might just be an oil painting of that inside the City Hall fountain, but we will see that that style has kind of been injected in. This is also an area where we can use things like IP adapter to guide that style. And so we'll touch on that as well and really kind of play with all the tools in the toolbox to see how we can inject style and get what we're looking for out the other side. Um, Typically LoRa values and the weights that you use on the LoRa, what you're kind of doing is dictating how much of that training is being injected into the underlying model. And in this case, we start with something that looks like a photo. We inject more of our oil painting, and over time, you're starting to see more of this look like oil painting. So if we increase this past one, which is we're going into like risky territory there when you go up above one, but it does kind of like hyper emphasize that concept in the underlying model weights. And so we're just kind of doing this experimentation here to see what this LoRa is going to inject. The other test that we'll do is actually pulling in that style of the exterior of the other building and seeing kind of what that pulls in. But I think this is it's a useful thought experiment to see how we're exploring this. This one looks particularly strange, but again, I think we're above the one on the LoRa weights, which I mean, it does look like an oil painting, but now we are kind of in this like grand imperial hall almost. There's like this all this marble in the background, and we're still looking at a fountain. Again, this goes back to the prompt, but it is kind of an oil painting of that. So we'll take away our oil painting. We kind of showed how that works. And in this case, we will see what happens when we use our fountain prompt. And again, this prompt is what's driving this fountain. And we effectively changed that to our city hall by tweaking the prompt. What we're trying to do now is fight the tendency of this prompt to generate a fountain and see if we can use these other tools to either inject the style or the content that we want to see. So we'll use IP adapter. We'll go through and maybe toss in this picture that we got as our IP adapter, and we'll put that at 0.5. And so now we're taking the prompt that we've got and this image and kind of fusing the understanding of these concepts together in order to get to that output. And ultimately, I think we're going to see it might even pick up a lot of this exterior of a building type concept from our image prompt. At least I'm hopeful of that. We can always increase the weight of our IP adapter as well. Noise is turning into an image. I have a feeling this isn't going to look as particularly City Hall-ish as I Yeah, it looks like a fountain in a brick.
Looks like from the same world,
It
not necessarily
does.
City Hall, but
Yes, yes,
some
exactly.
kind of square.
Yeah, we could, this is where we can play with this, right? So we can increase the weight of City Hall. Uh, we can also, if we want to, um, use the other City Hall we generated as part of our image
Mm.
prompts, right? And I'll bring these a little bit lower, maybe the brick a little bit lower, because this is definitely pulling a lot of like that brick and kind of, old industrial look. Um, and we'll pull this out. But I think this is a great example of how, if you've got a control net and you have a general style, you can compose new scenes and really drive that using IP adapter. There's a lot of like creative tools here and how you link these together. Um,
The other ideas of scenes we had, let me scroll up. Broken robot bodies strewn on the field. We
broken
have a
robot bodies.
ruined nuclear reactor.
Ooh, that's interesting. Uh,
Um, and I was feeling a bridge. I don't know, something about
bridge. Okay.
bridges, rickety bridges. Those are generally scenes in post-apocalyptic movies.
Very cool. So we got this. I think part of this might be there's not a lot of flexibility in the depth control net. It's 0.8 rather than something like 0.5. So I'll just decrease the weight on this, you know, pretty generously, um, just to show what reducing that looks like. Because I think we've kind of explored a lot of different options and tools. One that I think is useful here is just reducing the strength of that depth control net. So I think we might get something else, and then we'll dive into the interior of our nuclear reactor, and we'll go through maybe another way that you can get to that overall output you're looking for.
Blessed Coolant is saying depth map might be too strong and boxy.
Well, that's why decreasing the weight's going to give us a lot more flexibility. It means we have less control, but it also, when we turn it down to 0.3, now we actually have the ability for the model to kind of map its own understanding of what City Hall might look like to this new input. So we've got our City Hall, and the text actually isn't even that bad. It's pretty good. Um, so now we will go in and take out our City Hall marble fountains and stone. We're environment artwork of a post-apocalyptic world. We'll take out our control nets and our IP adapters. We're going to go with the interior of a nuclear reactor. We're going to go with type of things is inside of a green, like green glowing, green glow
Control panels.
control panels. Uh, Eerie glow. We want that kind of like eerie glow. Uh, and yeah, I guess we'll see what we get without doing any control, and then we'll ask ourselves how might we control it
Turbine, large
differently.
turbine blades.
Large turbine blades. We're definitely getting a green eerie glow. I bet you if there are any nuclear physicists in the audience, they're going to say that this doesn't look like a nuclear reactor. But I definitely get the vibe that this is inside of some sort of like sciency thing, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
so we've got our control panels. We've got this kind of like glow in the side over here. And if I like the composition on this, this is where you can do things like we'll throw in that as a control depth image, and now look, I've got like that layout, and so I can kind of play with that composition. I like that composition, but I want to give it another kind of like go on maybe getting the style down and focusing on different aesthetics. So this is a great way to kind of play around. You get something that you like and kind of iterate on it. um, there's another way that you can kind of get some control, and that's if you go on the canvas and you kind of like, you can either do this in Photoshop, you can do this on the unified canvas, but you give that kind of initial sketch of what that place might look like. You use things like where the colors might be. If you want to, you can pass in a control net, but that's another way. And then doing image to image on top of that, it's another way to get a lot of control. So if we like this layout, another thing that we can do is pass this in as our initial image. And then we can, play around with how much variation do we want on this. If we want to use this as our composition, we like the colors, we like the general vibe, but we want to see what some variations might look like. We might do something like 0.6. So I'll generate a new image at 0.6. And we'll see that we get a lot of that same placement. This is a no control net, because again, we're just using kind of the colors of this at a low denoising strength, and that's giving us a lot of the same types of places. There is one thing that I did wrong here though, and I'll call this out. If you generate, this is kind of like a technique, or like because of the nature of how this stuff works, if you generate an image with seed A, and then you do image to image on top of that, the initial noise is the same in both images, and so you get this very heavily saturated look. That's why this came out as like a lot more saturated and a lot more potent. So what we're going to do is we're going to shuffle the seed here, or turn it on random. And that means we're kind of setting a different initial noise than was used for the initial image. And this type of like accelerated saturation won't happen. I think we'll end up with something that looks a little bit more stylistically like our initial image.
We had a few questions that we could go through. Do you have a refiner enabled?
I do not have a refiner enabled. I don't typically utilize the refiner. That's not for any other reason than I think that the base models that have been trained on top of SDXL do a good enough job without a refiner. The refiner is an extra step of processing that I find is relatively inefficient, given the benefit that you get from just refining the prompt and everything else that you want to get the image you're looking for. If you think about the underlying mechanics, you have a like roughly 6 gigabyte SDXL model. That SDXL model is sitting in the GPU. And then you have this other model that's a completely different model called the refiner model, and that has to kind of also be loaded in or swapped in. And so from an efficiency standpoint, I just don't think the juice is worth the squeeze. Now, if you have a 24 gigabyte card, and I do, you could keep both of those at the ready in memory. And if you have enough RAM, then you're also just pulling out a RAM, but it's still more than I just find useful for this purpose. I think this is mostly just it's a personal preference. Some people really like playing around with the refiner, but I find for most practical use cases, you're able to get a pretty solid image, and you're able to control it well using just the base model. The other thing is, if you're doing any type of customizations on top of these tools, no one really trains the refiner. The refiner is not part of any regularly trained pipeline. And so you're not really leveraging the refiner for most custom pipelines. If you're a game studio, you're a movie studio, you're doing all kinds of fine tuning for your projects, the customizations are all being applied to like SDXL. That's where the LoRa is, and there isn't really a good mechanism right now for training that refiner for your use case. And so that's why I sit mostly on the base model. So answer to that question.
And then there were some questions around just what IP adapter is doing. I don't necessarily think the question is like around on the technical side, but kind of like it's just pulling in the style. Is it pulling in? And from my understanding, it kind of depends on the weight that you're setting that to. Where like when I play around with these, and I'm a beginner, but when I play around with these and I set the IP adapter to a low weight, I find that it's bringing in kind of more like vibe, style, color. You can put it next to it and you're like, okay, I see that it was like influenced by that.
Yeah.
And if you put it up kind of really high, on the weight, then it can actually understand specific concepts and things in the image. So it might actually pull out like an object in the image and infuse the understanding of that object. Is that right?
Yeah, yes, ish. I want to give an analogy. I don't want to get too technical, so I'm not going to go into like, the encoder is used and blah blah blah. I'll just talk about kind of like the analogy, almost the mental model that I have in my mind. When I think about designing the prompt, right? So we'll talk about the prompt. I've used this analogy before. I think of it like spreading peanut butter across, a piece of bread. The first very big, you drop the peanut butter on the bread and you start spreading it. That first area that you put the peanut butter on has more peanut butter, right? Like you end up losing peanut butter as you spread across the bread. It just gets thinner and thinner and thinner, right? That's like your prompt being used on the model, right? The initial terms you use are where most of the model's attention, and this term attention is kind of an actual like machine learning term, that's where the attention is focused. And that's where a lot of it is kind of like grabbing onto. And so you'll find if you put prompts, terms in the front of your prompt rather than at the end, it has a greater influence over the overall image, which is typically why, I either put something that we're trying to keep consistent across images, like a style, like a core style, or a subject if I'm playing around and really trying to get that subject in different styles. It's kind of why I put those terms first. IP adapter, in this same way, is taking the image and the text prompts, like both of these go together, and a higher weight IP adapter is putting more emphasis on what is in that image. And so it is looking at everything in the image. It's not kind of piecing out just style. It's not piecing out just, the subject. It's looking at that image and it's like, okay, I've got this image and this text prompt. And depending on the weight between these two, I'm going to kind of try to meld them together into that final image. If you decrease the weight of IP adapter, and again, this is like around 0.3, zero point 0.4, the subject of your text prompt gets more of the attention. And so that is where more of the attention kind of lands. It's almost like a magnet, right? It's like it's absorbing all of the attention. The spotlight is on the prompt. And so the subject that you put in the prompt typically is going to end up in your resulting image. And so then you're talking about like what's left over after the subject has had all its attention, like focused on what's in the text prompt. Style, right? It's things that look like this. You might find that if you use IP adapter, you get kind of part of the essence of what's in that as well. If we go back and we look at what we generated earlier, when we used IP adapter, we have a lot of this kind of like stone on the ground and red brick. There's trees in the background with a blue sky. Well, that's what we saw in this image that we used as an IP adapter, right? So we're not only getting the style, we are also picking up some of the concepts in the image. And so this isn't, just a perfect absorb the style, but, completely change the context and make this a completely different image, right? Like you are pulling out some elements of that image. But it's also a useful tool for that reason as well, because you can pepper in certain concepts that maybe you don't want to take over or dominate the output image, but you do want to kind of blend them in and mix them into the resulting output. Hopefully that kind of answers. I know I go into like my strange territory of peanut butter analogies, but hopefully that mental model is better than talking about the technical stuff like the image encoder.
PB&J's for lunch today.
PB&J's for lunch. What other questions do we have coming in?
I think we've covered most of them in the chat. If anyone has one that they feel like they didn't get answered, please feel free to repost it. But you can keep on. We have to make a few of these, I think.
Okay. I think another piece that I am thinking might be useful. I'm gonna upload something here. Bear with me for a second. Upload an image. So this is an example of like this is just an AI generated set of like different buildings or whatnot. But when you think about what IP adapter is doing, it is looking at things like, okay, this is a building reference sheet, or this is some kind of like modular reference sheet for different like buildings that might be in this world. And if we use this as an IP adapter, um, we can actually pull out that concept, not just of like the style, but we're actually pulling out the concept of like a modular building reference sheet, right? And so we can use that in our prompt, buildings, civilian buildings, maybe we'll just use the word term of buildings, and um, environment reference sheet. We've got, post-apocalyptic world. We maybe even increase the weight of that. So now we are producing hopefully a reference sheet of this. So I'm going to change the width and height to 1024 by 1024. And we'll see what we get. But this is like another way of quickly producing a number of different concepts using a single model.
And this is another place where a LoRa model could work, right? If you had, say,
100%.
A bunch of different modular environmental design kits in your... Ooh, nice.
Yeah, so we've got some pieces here. Like this might be good if I was trying to create consistent artwork for like an isometric top like 2.5D game, or like an RTS. Like I can imagine these being buildings that go in an RTS, right? Like there's a lot of really useful stuff here. And obviously I think some of these areas we might want to get a certain style. So let's just throw in, as kind of like conceptual inputs, we'll throw in our do this one, this guy, put that down to like 0.35, do this guy 0.35. So we'll see if we can kind of like guide it more towards this type of building rather than these like we've got some like shacks with palm trees here as well. So we're kind of like infusing that concept of big city hall and seeing how that's going to guide the generation process. So it looks like in this one, it has taken this to mean like different photos and almost like an image gallery type look, right? But also still helpful. And we might play around with, which of these do we prefer more of? If we actually like this layout, this is an area where we can use that kind of like image to image process with a relatively high denoising strength. And that'll really highlight that we want this modular look because it'll have that contrast between the background and the foreground. And so now we're not only using our IP adapters to kind of guide it towards this reference sheet look, we are using the actual initial image as well. That may be too high of a denoising strength. We'll let this generate, but then I'll decrease that to 0.85 and generate another one. We can take a peek at this while it's generating.
While it's generating, I know we've gotten this question a few times, but periods versus commas, your take?
Periods versus commas, like tabs and spaces in the developer world. I think it's all a little bit cargo culty and dark arts kind of stuff. The thing to note is that they are different. Period is different than a comma. It's different than a semicolon. It's different than a line break. They're all different. I don't think anybody really knows the mechanics of like, what does it think a period means? What does it think a comma means? What does it think a semicolon means? The way that I have just like started to use it, and this is, again, I don't claim this is truth. This is just me playing around, just a simple man trying to learn the technology too. The way that I've started to do it is using periods to separate kind of like conceptual groups. So if I'm talking about like environment artwork of a this, that's one sentence with a period, right? Or buildings and environment reference sheet, that's one sentence. I'm like, this is one thing. And then we're kind of adding in the style, and then we're adding in some other like aesthetic elements and kind of like separating them using periods. And that again is just my organizational style, and maybe it's more just helpful for me from a mental model perspective. I mean, we could go through and see what's different if it would be interesting between periods and commas and just like look at that. Maybe that is interesting. So I'll go back to this image that I had at the very start. I'll remix it, so that's going to load up all the settings that I had for this. Actually, I'll even do the seed. And so if I were to generate this same image, it's going to be the exact same, right? And in fact, I will show you if I generate that, it's the exact same. And the reason why it came out like that quickly is because it's cached. We don't rerun generations when it would generate the same image. We just use what's in the cache. So I've got this image now. I'm going to now change all of my periods to commas. So all the periods are now commas in this. So it is slightly different and it will regenerate. I don't anticipate that's going to change way too much, but it could. It could change quite a bit. Largely the same, except maybe my original, it got more of, it was more effective at actually being empty. There's a lot of stuff that's similar here. The same seed creates kind of roughly the same structure of the image, but conceptually, I prefer the one that has periods in it. And again, I don't know that this is correct, but it's what I have found is useful, to kind of separate out. Maybe it's as helpful for the model as it is for me in separating out these like concepts and making them kind of like coherent separate statements. Do with it what you will. I think the most important thing to take away is not I should use periods over commas when I want to do this stuff. It's you should experiment and understand what works best for your workflow, right? Because it could be that for what you're trying to generate, commas are better, and it could be that semicolons are better. It's just you have to play around and kind of figure out what is going to actually turn into a useful mechanism for you. I think most professionals really aren't looking at this technology to say, I want to go in and just play around with the prompt all day. Uh, what they want to do is they want to develop a set of tools they can repeatedly use to get certain parts of their job done, right? And so when you define that workflow, you find what's going to make the most sense for you and what those repeatable steps are that you can just kind of use as a part of your toolkit. And then you're just going to use those over and over again. So there's that refinement piece when you're figuring out what that tool looks like for you and what your workflow is. And then you're just going to incorporate that workflow into your day to day.
And we only have 4 minutes, so we don't have time to show that workflow. But I think that's helpful to think about kind of how we've spent this last hour, which is much more in this like exploration space where you're trying to define. Maybe it's the right prompts to get the right feeling that you're trying to invoke, or the right mix of IP adapters and depth maps. But the kind of next step is once you've figured that out once, and say now we're going into, we want to operationalize this, and I need to actually create like 20 images inside that school to really give like a full idea of that space. That's where a workflow could come in, where you could kind of map out the process that you've been doing, and then it's just a matter of slight tweaking, maybe the prompt of the space to give some variation in 20 images or whatever, what have you.
Yep, exactly.
And maybe that's an idea for a future YouTube video or
Yeah,
a
definitely.
session if people are interested in seeing that.
Yeah, I mean, if we took one of these things that we liked, We took the prompt out and we generated 50 of these, or change this to, we like this prompt, we like this style, and we're just going to like use a dynamic prompt to do 3 or 4 different types of buildings, so schoolyard, uh, you know, let's see, scavenger, camp, all these kinds of things. We can kind of go in and do that dynamic prompt and then just generate a lot of those and see what works from the outputs. But we've kind of like ironed out our workflow, ironed out the thing that's producing the images that are useful to our pipeline, and then using those. Cool. Anything
I
else we
think
need to cover
we're.
before we drop our studio? I think we made it in
I
time
think
this time.
we made it in time. Thanks everyone for joining. As usual, please share any feedback and post what you created. We'd love to see that. Also, would love to know what you'd like to see in the next studio session. Please drop that either in this chat or in the Invoke chat channel, and we'll look for those recommendations. And don't forget to join the next session. The event is already posted in the events tab, so just click interested there. We'll be doing it at the same time next Friday. And thank you, Kent, for walking us through.
You bet. Always fun. Take care, everybody. Have a good one. See you soon.